Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning and good evening to, as the case may be, for those who are watching through Zoom. No? I'm the outgoing dean of the School of Humanities of the Ateneo de Manila University. I'm very happy to welcome you to the third annual Kwan Laurel Endowment for the Humanities lecture. The endowment was conceived by the brothers Rodney and Robert Kwan Laurel in honor of their parents Roberto and Linda in 2019 to support the scholarly activities of the School of Humanities, and since 2022 has been underwriting the annual lectures. This year, the topic is Why Shakespeare Now? And our presupposition is expressed by this quotation from an essay by Harry Levin. His essay called The Crisis of Interpretation, and he says, like all the greatest writers, he, Shakespeare, undoubtedly merits continual reinterpretation, not only because his work is so rich in nuances to be discerned through rereading, but also because each succeeding generation must formulate its own relations with him. Okay. So maybe as a way of starting, let me tell you about the case of the Ateneo de Manila several generations ago. Shakespeare and Ateneo go back at least 114 years to 1910, when The Merchant of Venice was performed in the assembly hall of the school when it was still in Intramuros, no, in Old Manila. It was the first performance of a Shakespeare play in English in the country. When the American Jesuits took over the running of the school from the Spanish in 1921, one of the first things they did was to stage Julius Caesar, which was directed by a young Jesuit scholastic by the name of Henry Lee Irwin. This was followed by Macbeth in 1923, and King Lear in 1935, starring a very young Leon Maria Guerrero as King Lear, no? At the Manila Grand Opera House, the finest theater in Manila at that time. One of the most interesting things about these early productions is that they retained at least one original practice. Because Ateneo was an all-boys school, all the female parts were played by boys, no? As they had been in Shakespeare's own time. So why Shakespeare then? The American Jesuits thought that dramatics were a good way for the boys to learn English, and Shakespeare in particular was good training in public speaking. In the late 1940s, in fact, the Ateneo de Manila staged excerpts from Julius Caesar in Latin translation as a way for the boys to learn rhetoric. But the other reason was political, and according to Miguel Bernad, Shakespeare was a way through which Catholic schools like Ateneo could show that they were as good as state schools, the godless state schools, and the schools run by American Protestants. No? So this was 20s and 30s. No? Prejudice against Catholics was probably a continuation of the anti-clericalism and masonry of Rizal and friends, no? In the 19th century. And the effect also of more recent American propaganda against Spain. No? But such was the cultural import of Shakespeare even then that it proved good PR for Ateneo. No? So flash forward to 2024, no? Many decades later, why Shakespeare now? That's something that I leave to our speakers to discuss this afternoon. They are Ben and Beatrice, as in Much Ado About Nothing. We can expect a lot of clash of wits, I hope. No? Ben Crystal is an actor and author. He played Hamlet in the first original pronunciation production of the play in 400 years. His book, Shakespeare on Toast, was shortlisted for the 2010 Educational Writer of the Year Award. With his father, David Crystal, he co-authored Shakespeare's Words and Everyday Shakespeare. He founded ShakespeareEnsemble.com, which mounts productions that fuse Elizabethan rehearsal methods and modern physical theater techniques. Beatrice Lay is a leading figure in global Shakespeare scholarship, the author of several articles on Shakespeare productions in Asia, and co-editor of Shakespeare's Asian Journeys. She is the chair of the Asian Shakespeare Association, the Assistant Director of the Shakespeare Association of America, and a trustee of the International Shakespeare Association. She is a research fellow at the Research Center for Digital Humanities of the National Taiwan University and the director of the Taiwan Shakespeare Database. And our moderator is Dame Judy Ik, the chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of the Philippines. Okay? So I leave it to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to be here from the Godless State School down the road. But just to put you guys in your place, you Ateneans, that performance of Merchant was the second production in English. The first one was at a normal school about a month before that one, so just a month. Okay, and that photo where they had actors playing, they weren't women's parts because what the Ateneo fathers did was change the daughters into sons. So Lear there is howling over the dead Donald, okay, not Cordelia. Very strange things have happened to Shakespeare over time. But anyway, thank you. Like I said, very happy to be here. Very happy to be with Ateneo. See a lot of my collaborators in theater from Ateneo. I'm an Ateneo parent, so I have great ties with Ateneo, except UAAP season. Hindi tayo pati. Anyway, I'm happy also to be moderating this talk with a very good friend of mine, Dr. Beatrice Lee, and Ben Crystal, who I've only met in the lead up to this event, but I'm very excited to talk to him too because he does quite exciting work in Shakespeare. So we go, or do we have to? Can we acknowledge the presence of the ambassador? Yes.
We're honored to have with us His Majesty's Ambassador to the Philippines. Sounds like a James Bond movie. Miss Laurel Fils. No?
Okay, I guess we begin with Ben and Beatrice. And I'm going to begin with the large question, which is the question that is the title of today's talk. Why Shakespeare now? But I'm going to ask them to break that down into two questions. Why Shakespeare and why now? So, Beatrice, do you want to start?
All right. Hello. I'm really honored to be here. And last time I was here, it was 2018 at attending a conference, Shakespeare Traffics Tropics, organized by Judy and Professor Ricardo Abad. It was one of the most memorable conferences I had. And although Ricky cannot be with us today, but I think the question we're asking deeply resonates with his scholarly and theatrical work. So I think we'll get his blessing. When we were planning this event, we were brainstorming about what we should do. And I came up with the question, why Shakespeare? I think Judy added the now. Why Shakespeare? Because it was a real question. More than 20 years ago, must be, when I first started teaching, I got a job in Hsinchu, which is considered like the Silicon Valley of Taiwan. And Tsinghua University has world-class STEM programs. So our students build semiconductor factories and nuclear power plants. And by comparison, the foreign language department I taught at is tiny and heavily leaned toward applied linguistics. I was the only pre-modern, early modern. I taught English from Beowulf through Samuel Johnson, and I loved it. But one day my boss, the department chair, confronted me with a newspaper clip in her hand and said, "This is a very interesting article. You must read." I said, "Okay." So it was written by a guy named Robert Taylor, a UK-based journalist. And in the article, he talked about he watched a performance of Measure for Measure in London, and it was dull and incomprehensible. He said, well, there's the synopsis in the program because otherwise no one would understand what was going on. And there was no intermission because otherwise everyone would have fled. So he just whined about how boring and useless Shakespeare is, and then we should just all admit that we don't like him, we don't need him. Enough is enough. So that's his conclusion. He said Shakespeare has lost its appeal. No, he's certainly not the first one to have that opinion, and that is fine. Everyone is free to have their opinion. But the problem is my boss seemed to agree with him, you know? That was a serious problem for me. But fortunately, I got a different job. I moved to a research university in Taipei, where I was the 8th Shakespearean hired by my department. So we got research money, we got money to run conferences and events and get invited speakers and all that. And I even built the Taiwan Shakespeare database. So for years, I did not have to worry about job security by not being able to answer, why Shakespeare? But yet that question haunts. So I think it's not just for teachers, but also for scholars, theater practitioners, manga artists, filmmakers, television producers. Like we all get that question if we do Shakespeare. Why Shakespeare? And why Shakespeare now, right? We understand why Shakespeare then with Ateneo, right? But why Shakespeare now? And I guess the most straightforward answer is that Shakespeare is the lingua franca. Okay, so Shakespeare gets you to travel across linguistics, national, cultural borders. Shakespeare got me here. That seems very obvious. I exemplify that answer. I'm here, right? Without Shakespeare, I wouldn't be here. And also, Wu Xingguo, the Chinese opera master from Taiwan, is another good example because he does traditional Chinese opera titles, he does original works, but these works are rarely performed outside of Taiwan. By comparison, Shakespeare got him everywhere. He went to Edinburgh, Avignon, London, New York, Chile, Romania, name it, like more than 20 countries. And Shakespeare just, no one wanted to see his other works. They just wanted Shakespeare. So if you have any international ambition, Shakespeare serves your purpose, like with me and with Wu Xingguo. But, to say that Shakespeare is like US dollars or a US passport that gets you anywhere in the world is a very shallow answer. We want to go a little deeper beyond that, Shakespeare is convenient. Shakespeare is practical. I think today we want to really dig deeper into the question. So let me pause it here and then we'll go deeper later.
Okay, but at least you answered half my question about value, that Shakespeare is a lingua franca and it's a way for cultures to connect in the world now through Shakespeare. Ben, are you here, Ben? Oh, there you are, Ben. Hi.
Hi there.
Why Shakespeare? Why Shakespeare now?
Beautiful questions, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this conversation today. It's a great pleasure to be with you all virtually, if not physically. Gosh, so why Shakespeare? As opposed to Marlowe or Johnson, one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, why are we talking about Shakespeare today? And when I think about what it is that brought Shakespeare into our focus more than his contemporaries. I think about the 20 years that he was writing with, by and large, the same group of actors, that there's a tremendously intense, collaborative, creative output between these group craftsmen, of course, because as Jonathan said, this was a male-oriented practice in Shakespeare's England. Over the course of the 20 years, Shakespeare never really seemed to write the same thing twice. That if anything, he seemed to create a roadmap of a blueprint of something that he was trying to explore either thematically or in terms of his writing style, in terms of the human condition. I'll come back to the human condition in a minute. But once he'd written, it was like he would scrap that blueprint and throw it away and start afresh. That in terms of reinventing himself, we might like to think of someone like David Bowie, who reinvented himself with every album. Shakespeare was reinventing himself not just with every play, with every one of his 154 sonnets, but that within each of these works, he was pushing the boundaries of what the writing style, the poetic style that he was writing in could do, of what the theaters that he was practicing could do, of what the actors that he was working with for 20 years could do, of what theater could do, of the power of coming together, building a community of theater-going audience and pushing them and challenging them with the thoughts and ideas that he was exploring and expressing. There are theatrical breakthroughs in the beginning of his writing, in his earliest plays, that still make my jaw drop and would be a challenge to a modern playwright today. There are equally brilliant dramaturgical steps forward in the middle of his writings and at the end too. So why Shakespeare? For me, it's because he really raised the bar, or they really raised the bar of what could be. He really pushed the edges of potential in terms of what you might expect to receive when going to the theatre. And why Shakespeare now? And I don't know about you, Beatrice and Judy, but it's a question that I'm asked the most: the relevance of Shakespeare, and indeed how keep and make Shakespeare accessible today. And we can get distracted a lot by making Shakespeare modern, by putting his play in modern dress or modern dialect of resetting his plays in modern settings to try to drag him into the 21st century. The timelessness or the universality of Shakespeare allows his works to be now are because, I believe, because they are filled with lines that are not about living in the 16th century, and they're not about being from London or from Stratford upon Avon, from England or from the British Isles. He wrote lines that were to do with being human, examine the human condition. And no matter where you are, where you're from, or what time period, a London life persist, resonate with us as long as there are thinking, breathing, feeling humans to engage with these ideas. That's what keeps Shakespeare in the era now for me.
So long as men can breathe and eyes can see. What about the women? We'll get to that. But clearly, both of you speak about sort of Shakespeare's value, Shakespeare's urgency, his potential as lingua franca, his potential as, just showing human potential, what writing could be, what theater can be, what collaboration and community can be, and challenging them. And as Ben says, raising the bar. So clearly there is great value in Shakespeare and clearly continuing value in Shakespeare. Otherwise, we're not having this conversation. But it's also quite difficult, speaking as someone who works in Shakespeare in this part of the world, even supposedly in a university of some repute. It's still hard to get people to see that value. It's still hard to, get kids to say, come watch this play, come enroll in this course, come major in Shakespeare. And I'm just wondering, if we all share this idea of Shakespeare's value, how then do we put that across? Okay. So I'd like to ask Beatrice and Ben to speak about exactly that, how we communicate that value, how we get people, to see, to read, to love Shakespeare, and maybe talk a little bit about how you fell in love, this little girl in Taiwan or this young boy in Wales. Why you didn't feel that was so alien. Beatrice.
Okay, so I think for my students, Shakespeare actually is something they are more familiar with than compared to Chaucer, Spenser, Milton. So I think among all the British writers we teach, like actually Shakespeare is among their favorites. Because why? I think Shakespeare, as I said, is the lingua franca. So everyone seems to know a little bit, more or less, about Shakespeare. So it's almost like, even though he's difficult, his language is difficult, but for my students who don't, who did not start learning English until later year, like I started learning English at age 13, so English was not my native language. So for them, learning English literature is actually a hard subject. And Shakespeare, even though his language is hard, but because of the stories, because of the characters, he actually seems more familiar. And then how do we make him relevant? And then I think my answer to that question is politics. I think it's interesting because I think the question we asked today, Shakespeare, why Shakespeare now? We can add another, why Shakespeare here, right? So I think that question will be different. I think Ben has a different answer as to why Shakespeare here or why Shakespeare there. And then, so I want to use Macbeth as an example of why Shakespeare here. It's interesting, for decades, if you watch film adaptations of Macbeth, you see that in the West, in the US, often Macbeth becomes like a restaurant owner, a business tycoon, or like a mafia. Why? Because it is harder for them to imagine the real political struggle like that happening in modern society. While us in Asia, we have a much better imagination. So Macbeth here and Macbeth there can be very different. So I have a few examples I want to talk about how it is relevant and urgent. So yeah, thank you. Um, right, so we'll wait for the slides. This is Taiwan President Chen Shui-bian and his wife. So while I was teaching in Macbeth, he was running for his second term. And then meanwhile, he was caught in corruption scandals. And then chances were slim that he would win. But the day before the election, he got shot. And then we didn't know what happened. Everyone was like, oh, is he dying? You know, who did it? You know, his political opponent, China, Russia, who? You know, everyone's like, and then we didn't know what happened, how bad it was, whether he was dead or alive. And the election took place next day. And then he won by a very narrow margin. And then later we realized that his injury was minor, like a cut. So people like me thought it was a staged performance to win sympathy vote. So when I took my students to Hong Kong to attend the Chinese University Shakespeare Festival, I did, next. It's not working. How do I? Okay. Can you get to the next slide? So I did a political allegory, and with Macbeth running a presidential campaign, the three witches are rallying, say, yes, Macbeth, you will win. This competition, you know, the rules was that you have to use all Shakespeare's words, no addition was allowed. So all the language was Shakespeare. But I did the Macbeth prophecy with the Raleigh. And then Lady Macbeth gave him a gun. And instead of killing Duncan, I had Macbeth go off stage and came out with a bloody shirt. So he staged a shooting, and then he got to power by foul play. And then when in the original, the witches said, Macbeth, don't worry, you'll be fine, right? Here is Lady Macbeth waving a US passport, said, you'll be fine, don't worry about it. And then he ended up in jail. So like that's the president. Later, President Chen Shui-bian was, you know, sent to jail. He got out easily, but you know, at least he was there for momentarily. So I had that same. We did this in Hong Kong, and then the Hong Kong audience was shocked because they never saw anything like that. At the Chinese University Shakespeare Festival, mostly it's supposed to be faithful. It's a Shakespearean education, and then at most people stylized it with like some fancy costumes. But this was the first time that we did something bold, even though we were using Shakespeare's language, but we addressed contemporary issues. So there were protests, massive protests in Taipei when this happened. And it was like a very serious concern. People were like, what's happening to our democracy? What's happening? You know, it's like, if people can easily manipulate the system, can abuse the system like this, you know, what will happen to us? But I think in Taiwan's story, it was like more or less a happy ending because he ended up in jail. So in a way, you kind of got the justice, but it's not always the case. And the next. I cannot get to the next slide. Can you just do it for me? Okay, and here you are with the beautiful Dame Judy and the magnificent Teroy, right? So I think she can talk about this. I don't need to address this. So in the same year, there's a Macbeth here. In the same year, 2011, right? I did my Macbeth. Judy and Anton Huang, they did their Macbeth. And the next, please. Also, in the year after 2012, this was a film called Shakespeare Must Die, Thailand. And then because it was banned, and then they did another documentary called Censor Must Die. So next. So this is about the King Duncan, looks like the old Thai king. And next. And Macbeth, the Macbeth figure is obviously Taksin. Next. So with a beautiful wife, just like Taksin did. Next. But this story, this Macbeth does not end us happily, because Prince Malcolm delivers his last speech. You remember in Shakespeare, it's like, oh, justice is restored, Macbeth is dead, you know. But here, Malcolm delivers the last speech in prison, beaten up. So he was just dreaming that justice will come back. It's not there yet. So next, please. So Taksin, even though in an exile abroad, is still influencing the people by media. He had like huge Twitter and Facebook and social media account, and then he's talking to people from abroad. So at least not in the film, we don't see justice restored, and then we are still struggling. And the next, please. Next. Is that it? So here are some examples, as I said, you know, in Asia, we don't have to reimagine Macbeth as a restaurant owner, because we get the real thing here. And then it is actually, like Dennis Kennedy said, Shakespeare is like a coded agent. So with his original language, or, you know, you can blame Shakespeare by performing resistance. And then, even though in Thailand, the film was still banned, but you can say, well, it's Shakespeare, right? We didn't make it up. Like my Macbeth, we didn't make it up. And Judy can probably talk about how much made up or faithful is Screen Macbeth, right? So Shakespeare allows you to address questions that would otherwise be censored. You can just blame Shakespeare. Right. Okay, so maybe.
Okay. So if you want to avoid censorship, do Shakespeare. I think that's a great enticement, Beatrice. And I think your examples are great of showing how around Asia, without that bardolatry, without that need to be genuine and original and authentic, we have Shakespearean stories all our own, or maybe more Shakespearean than Shakespeare. That's even possible. But we'll explore those examples later. But Beatrice's answer is to avoid censorship, do Shakespeare. What's Ben's answer? What's the best enticement, Ben, for doing Shakespeare, you think?
Well, I could only really speak to my own experience, which was pretty big, because I hated Shakespeare in school. You couldn't have dragged me to a Shakespeare play when I was 15, 16 if you had, I don't know, given me a gold car. I didn't like studying his plays. I didn't like reading them. They didn't make sense to me. I wanted to own a computer games shop when I was 15 or 16. And I was in the high school musicals, but I couldn't sing very well at the time, and I was given 5 character parts to play in the musical Oliver, and I came on as an old man and then rushed off and got a different costume and came on as a young man and all that kind of thing. And a woman came up to me afterwards and said that she was setting up an amateur dramatics repertory company, and their first play was going to be a Shakespeare play, and would I come and audition for her? And I said, no, thank you. I don't like Shakespeare. I don't want to do that. She said, no, please come along. And I did. And they were doing The Tempest, one of Shakespeare's last plays, set on a magical island with a wizard and a spirit of the air, and a half man, half fish, son of a witch. And then shipwrecked on that island are a king and a prince and all the courtiers. And she ended up casting me as Ariel, as the spirit of the air. Now, by this point, I was 17 years old. I just passed my driving test. All of my school friends were coming to see this show. And we rehearsed it every Monday and Thursday nights for, I think it must have been 10 weeks. And there are funny bits in The Tempest. There's some good jokes in it. But once you've heard those jokes for 7 or 8 weeks in an empty hall with no audience, those jokes really stop being funny very, very quickly. And I'm playing the spirit of the air. And it was easy for my friends who were playing the wizard. You can be all wizardly like Gandalf, I suppose. And if you're playing a half man, half fish, son of a witch, then you can take on the physicality of like a half a man and, I don't know, some sort of fish physicality, I suppose. Son of a witch, I suppose we might think that might be evil in some way. But how do you play the spirit of the air? And I knew from my musical days that it would all come together when we got the costume. And I turned up on the dress rehearsal day, and in amateur dramatics, dress rehearsal is usually the day before the first public performance. And I get to the rehearsal rooms. I drive to the theater because I passed my driving test. And I get to the rehearsal, to the theater, and Peter, who's playing the wizard, has got this beautiful wizardly cloak and a wizardly hat and a wizardly staff. And he's walking around like a wizard, and you sort of, oh yeah, you can see that character. And Brian, who was playing Caliban, the half man, half fish, son of a witch, had this amazing like makeup and this sort of netting, and yeah, he looked incredible. And I go to the dressing room, and it's got the light bulbs all around the mirror, and my name is beneath the mirror where my costume is sitting, and I look and I can't see my costume, and I lift up some pieces of fabric in case the costume might be underneath it, and there's someone says to me, no, 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 that is your costume. And what they'd given me was 2 pieces of silk and a piece of string to tie those pieces of silk together, and a very large pot of gold paint. And I had to cover myself from head to foot in this gold paint. And of course, I'm ginger, right? So gold paint and ginger hair, I basically looked like a candle, a lit candle. And the pieces of silk were golden as well. So certainly looked, I guess, magical. The annoying thing was, of course, that this costume wasn't going to help me fly. Playing the spirit of the air. So we get to the first performance, and I'm terrified about going on stage. And Peter, who's playing Prospero the Wizard, he calls out, "Come, my Ariel, come." And that's the cue to the stage. We're playing outside in North Wales, September, so it's raining and it's windy. Everyone's sitting in this stone amphitheater, and I'm standing behind them. I hear Peter say, "Come, Ariel," and I don't move. I'm quivering with fear because I just don't know what I'm going to do when I jump onto that stage. Peter said again, "My Ariel, come," and I'm like, I'm still not moving. And he said again with quite a lot of frustration, now, "Come, my Ariel, come." And feet decide that they're going to start moving, even if the rest of my body doesn't want to. And I run down this little stone ramp behind the audience. I think I jumped over the first row of the audience, actually. And the next thing I remember, the end of the show, and I looked at Peter and said, "What happened?" And he said, "You flew." Now, of course, I didn't actually fly, but the experience acting Shakespeare, of learning the lines by heart, of forming them with an audience, so different from every experience of Shakespeare I'd had previous. I think that we are getting the introduction of Shakespeare to people, to young heart, mind, wrong. At least in this country, love to hear how it's first introduced to people in the Philippines. And that's great to hear. Over here, it's introduced on the page. It's introduced to something to read. We're not really told why Shakespeare writes in poetry or why his characters speak in poetry. And that means that in Shakespeare's time, people walk around speaking in poetry to each other. Of course, they don't, but that is the impression that plays were given. I suppose what I've learned over the years is that being invited to read a Shakespeare play is no different, really, to being invited to read the score of Mozart's Requiem. The only way you're really going to understand those little black dots is if you've learned how to read music, or maybe to learn how to make an incredible dish, you might need to be a master chef and really understand how all those ingredients work together. The only people that read Shakespeare written down were his actors, and they had been spending the bulk of their lives since they were 12 or 13 years old learning how to read those scores or those recipes, those manuals for how to perform. And how engaging with them in isolation, away from an audience. And the audience with the Shakespeare play is really the battery that lights up the electrical circuit of that experience. That's why these plays don't make sense in rehearsal, because you need an audience to power them, essentially. So the best way that I know to engage people with Shakespeare is not to demand that they study the works or be examined on them, but to be encouraged to play with them, to make those words their own, and to dare to gift some of these words to someone that they know, as if they are words coming from their own heart, and to experience what it is to have agency and playfulness and indeed ownership over Shakespeare.
And a lot of gold paint, right?
That's also very useful.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. I mean, I'm totally with you, Ben. I understand the magic of performance. I understand the magic of the words coming out of your mouth, discovering rhythm, discovering moments in rehearsal, etc. But I wonder how feasible that is. I mean, I guess we work with school children and put Shakespeare on its feet and make them perform, and that's going to make them fall in love. Is that what you're?
Well, I mean, of course, it depends on the age.
What's
This is
the best age? Just out of curiosity.
Well, I'm a patron of Shakespeare Week, which is a Shakespeare Birth Trust initiative, bringing Shakespeare into primary schools. Work with a lot of 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-olds, introducing them to Shakespeare. And perhaps the biggest quality youth, young mind and heart is playfulness and imagination. And they're brilliant at creating their own world. And with the right sort of invitation, bringing them into worlds they haven't created to play in, whether that's the world of fairies or the world of magic or the world of sword fighting. These are very familiar, playful worlds to exist to. And I think that's the key to it. We have decided that soon that we get our next generations thinking and proving that they're thinking clever and intellectual and adult-like way, the better. But the education models in Scandinavia and in Europe that insist that there is no testing and examining before sometimes as late as 11 or 12, and that the early years are filled with play. We don't allow that with Shakespeare. At least over here, we decide that Shakespeare must be immediately tested on. There's no playground with Shakespeare. These are plays, after all, they're not called leads. They are an invitation to be playful in your imagination. So when I introduce young minds and hearts to Shakespeare, there's never a book in place, and there's not the printed or written word either. You can genuinely start with some of the darker plays. I've had some really good experiences with young kids who desperately want to go to Titus Andronicus and Winter's Tale. They're not interested in Midsummer Night's Dream.
Yeah, how to be playful with Titus Andronicus. That's a real question. Ask Lucy Bailey, she did it. Anyway, playfulness, that's a great idea because that sort of playfulness. So teachers, do not be strict about Shakespeare. Do not give objective exams. Allow them to play with the text. Allow them to imagine, because that's the kind of imagination and playfulness that produces the kind of Shakespeares that Beatrice was talking about earlier. If I may share in my own experience as a Filipino, when I was starting out in Shakespeare, I was very proud of the fact that I read it in English, that I spoke English, I read English, and I knew my Shakespeare. But then when I encountered Chinese opera Shakespeare and no Shakespeare, and Shakespeare in the countries without English, I was floored. Because what we had here are like, well, you saw those pictures of Lear and the dead Donald, trying so hard to be faithful. When it was the unfaithful Shakespeare, the Shakespeare that used the imagination, that fused it with native indigenous theater traditions, that allowed the Shakespeare to sort of fly, to use Ben's example earlier. That was fascinating to me. And that sort of sense of creativity, I think, is what Beatrice was trying to show us with your examples. And that's your answer to the why here, right?
And also, I want to add that it's a little ironic that we actually use Shakespeare. Shakespeare is made, put to use to decolonize and de-imperialize. So you would Shakespeare is supposed to be the tool of imperialization and colonization. But no, we actually do the opposite, not only with our adaptations, but also Shakespeare helps us to build a community. I think for me as a scholar, and I think for Judy as well, it's so important. Again, that brings us to the question, why Shakespeare here, instead of why Shakespeare now? Because I'm from Taiwan, which is very close to the Philippines, right? But I would say most of us are pretty ignorant about each other. Culture, language, politics, history, right? Why? Because when we go to school, we study English, we study Shakespeare, right? We study the European Renaissance, right? I never learned about the Filipino Renaissance. I suppose there was one at some point in history, right? We never studied that in the history books. And you never studied anything about Taiwan, right? And it's true about our students know nothing about Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand, even though we're so close, right? We know very well all the Henrys or the Richards, from English history, right? We know the American president. We know who founded America, the founding father of America. We don't know the founding father of Korea, for example, right? But thanks to Shakespeare, we built a community. Why? Because as I show you, what I didn't get to show you, but it's okay. It's a Malaysia Macbeth, which is faithful to the original, but that it was staged on the same night of the election says a lot, right? So even though it's Shakespeare, but people on stage and people in the audience, they have a common language. They know this is more than the original Shakespeare. So as I showed you, like because of the Taiwan Macbeth, because of the Filipino Macbeth, the Thai Macbeth, the Malaysian Macbeth, we get to like, oh, you're just like us. Now I recognize you. I recognize it's not like, oh, just some foreign history with some unpronounceable names, who cares? No, it's like, oh, so you're just like me, right? We realize that we actually have a lot in common. And through Shakespeare, we can go deeper. I realize, okay, so this is Malaysian politics. I get to understand it a little better. It's not completely foreign. Just it belongs to a different country. It's a different language. It's none of my business. But thanks to Shakespeare, we get to see that we are actually global citizens. We're all alike. And then we can talk deeper. And then instead of going to, like Judy got her PhD in the States, I got my PhD in the States, and my professor got their PhD in the UK or Canada. So we tend to look there. We never look around us. We never look, oh, Philippines, oh, Malaysia. We never look this way. We always look that way. But thanks to Shakespeare, we're looking around and hi. We start to build a community. So 10 years ago, we started the Asian Shakespeare Association. And we want Shakespeareans from Asia to meet in Asia. We don't have to go to Stratford-upon-Avon to meet. We can meet here. And then each time we bring the conference to a different place, then we learn about that place. We learn about our neighbors. So it would be very hard to do it. Suppose it's a Chinese opera conference, right? If I do it here, people don't know anything about it and are not really interested in it, right? But with Shakespeare, we have a common interest. And from there, we can build a good community. And so instead of learning, in addition to learning about Shakespeare, we're learning about each other through Shakespeare. And I think that's really meaningful.
I was just told, sorry, we have to pause right here. I was just told that I was to invite you into the conversation, Madam Ambassador, to say a few words.
You certainly don't have to invite me into the If I could just use this. Sorry, if I could just use this opportunity to say a few words, I'd love that. And I'm so sorry to interrupt you. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you. Thank you for hosting this amazing event, and thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be back at Ateneo. I'm so happy that you're having this conversation and creating that space to pause and ask this really important question: why Shakespeare? Why now? Why here? And I'm so happy that there are so many students that are making the time to listen and engage. And I had a few things that I wanted to say upfront, but now that I'm speaking now, I'm actually going to react to a few things you said. Because I've learned so much just listening to the three of you. And you know, when I was thinking white Shakespeare, I was obviously thinking about the modern day relevance and the fact that so much of what he wrote about is still relevant here and across the world. I was thinking about the humor. I was thinking about the language. Is it nearly 2,000 words that I think he wrote that are obviously so relevant for the way we speak today across the world? I was thinking that some of his characters have become modern day nouns, and that's quite useful as a way to engage. What I hadn't been thinking about at all is Shakespeare as a political tool. I hadn't thought at all about unfaithful Shakespeare. I love that term, or fusion Shakespeare. So I'm feeling quite inspired to think differently about Shakespeare on the back of this conversation, and to really think about him through the lens of that community building, building and using an international language that everyone can relate to. But Judy, I do want to come back to your original challenge, and indeed the point that you were making, Beatrice, about that article that you had read in the first university you were at in Taiwan. It's a really important challenge. I do think Shakespeare is impenetrable and is difficult. And I have been to see plays where I was, I'm a bit embarrassed to say, a bit bored, because I didn't really, you know, I knew the story, but I still didn't, it just didn't speak to me. And then I felt a bit stupid because if you're smart, you're supposed to get it. So I felt a bit inadequate. And so that question is really worth asking. How do we engage with the younger generation in particular to make it relevant and to make it cool and modern? And so, you know, the point about how do you market Shakespeare, at what age, and through what entry points, I think is a really valid question. I had my first kind of real Shakespeare moment akin to what you were describing, Ben, with The Tempest around Othello. And I was, again, blown away by that. I felt at the time that Shakespeare is a prize you have to earn. You know, it's not easy. It's really, really difficult language. But once you unpack it, sometimes with the help of a teacher, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an English language scholar, that it's like a maze, and every turn you discover something more precious and more beautiful, and you shine and you're wowed. But you know, I was blown away by Othello, but it was years later that I was nonetheless bored when watching another play. So it's not because you've cracked it once that you've cracked them all. And so I think the question is really worth asking. And this is where perhaps, and this is another debate and conversation altogether, one has to think about education being not just, you know, receptive, responding to demand, but also thinking about what ought to be taught to create that demand ultimately in later life, and also to equip young people with an appetite and thirst for great things that wouldn't have come otherwise. I think if we stop teaching Shakespeare as a compulsory subject in many schools, the demand and knowledge and interest will diminish, and it might become a smaller group which is seen as an elite. And what you don't want, precisely for the political and otherwise reasons you set out, is a Shakespeare elite that doesn't talk to the masses. So I do think there's a case for continuing to teach Shakespeare, for continuing to bang on about Shakespeare, and continuing to take pride and Shakespeare, certainly for us also as the British government, notwithstanding the challenges that are absolutely valid around colonization that you made, Beatrice. And for teachers to continue to take students on that journey, which takes time. You know, if you're going to study a piece in depth, like I did Othello, that's over a term that you do that. You know, it's not something you can dip in and out as a poem. So lots and lots of food for thought. I don't come away with answers, but I certainly come away with inspiration and a desire to go back to the drawing board and to some of the beautiful Shakespeare that I read when I was much younger, and make more space for it also in my personal life, and make space for it when I travel. I was in Taiwan just 10 days ago, and henceforth when I travel, I will try to go and see a Shakespeare play or a Shakespeare's festival. And I will conclude with just a thought that you triggered as well about, you know, those Shakespeare festivals where you're allowed to, you must use nothing but Shakespeare, kind of a, I don't know how you call it, but how fun and innovative in that. And what other author in the world would enable you to do that? That goes from everything from talking about romance and treachery and jealousy to great political crises and betrayal and ambition. And, you know, to have someone who's able to talk about all of that across so many different vectors, I think is truly phenomenal. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and your experiences. I really enjoyed learning about your personal experiences. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm so sorry again to interrupt you. I'm just going to leave discreetly by the side door. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Do we have to open up to the floor now, or can I ask more? No, there's one more thing I want to ask Ben, because Beatrice was talking about how foreign Shakespeare or Shakespeare around, you know, in Asia or in other parts of the globe, Shakespeare feels foreign, and how we don't have to make him feel foreign by talking to each other in Shakespeare. And I was just wondering with Ben, how foreign Shakespeare feels for you, or does it? And does this connect at all to your work with original pronunciation? Is that some kind of search for authenticity, or is that a way to defamiliarize or refamiliarize or make contemporary? Because I noticed listening to I watched some of your videos doing OP Shakespeare, and it doesn't sound like, you know, BBC RSC English. It sounds Welsh, or, you know, it sounds like a decentered English. So I'm kind of wondering about the impetus and the politics behind OP.
Yeah, okay. So what feels foreign in Shakespeare to me is oftentimes actually the piece of Shakespeare that I engaged with last week or last month or last year that I felt at that time, oh, I really understand this. I really resonate with this. Then because I've lived another week, another month, or another year, and I've grown a little, I hope, as a human, there's a degree of, just talk about peeling the onion character, but there's a degree of another layer within writing that, let's say it's a sonnet. Let's say it's 18, the most famous of Shakespeare's sonnets, shall I compare thee to a summer day? And my first understanding of that it was a very beautiful piece of poetry. And as I fast forwarded my life 10 years later, I understood it to be quite a beautiful testament of love. I probably accessed that foreign land having experienced something love. And got Shakespeare's original pronunciation, and shall I compare thee to a summer's day became shall I compare thee to a summer's day. And what was familiar for me in Shakespeare became foreign. um, any original practice and that any exploration or experiment where we're trying to recreate a dynamic that Shakespeare in fact has experienced, whether that's the original practice of architecture in the form of Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London, or the Shakespeare North Playhouse Theatre in Merseyside, or ensemble dynamic, Jonathan opened with it being an all-male company, or the rehearsal practices that my company explores, where we try and explore how quickly we could make a Shakespeare play. And they were understood to have made their plays not in 10 weeks, but in 2 or 3 days. And we've been making Shakespeare in Shakespeare productions in 2 or 3 days for the last 10 years. Or indeed with this recreation of the accent that Shakespeare spoken. If we reach towards authenticity, I think we'd be in trouble. When the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre opened, people worried that actors walking around in Elizabethan costume in that 400-year-old style of theatre would become a museum piece and just an attempt to recreate the past. Of course, that building is very close to what we understand Shakespeare's Globe Theatre to have been like, but it's not authentic because Shakespeare's Globe burnt down. And whilst the modern Globe has a thatched roof, it also has sprinklers in it. Shakespeare's Globe Theatre's floor was filled with mud and excrement because sometimes those theatres were used for bear baiting. The modern Globe stage audience floor is concrete, of course. Shakespeare's Globe's audience were battling the plague. And we certainly don't want a truly authentic experience of going to the theatre and leaving with some terrible infectious disease. The accent recreation is a fusion of the sounds that we understand Shakespeare was hearing when he was writing, and we can work that out to about 80% right. And then the last 10 to 20% is filled with my natural speaking voice, and my natural speaking voice is a little bit from near London, and a little bit from Wales, and a little bit from Ireland, and a little bit from Lancashire, where I went to university, and a little bit of Transatlantica because I've had the universal credit card of Shakespeare to guide me around the world. And so when you hear me speak original pronunciation, you hear 80% the sound of Shakespeare, and the last 10 to 20% is filled with my accent. So that's why, Judy, you heard, or have heard online, slight Welsh tinges. The curious thing is that when audiences hear original pronunciation, wherever they are around the world, tend to tune into the sound that's most familiar to them. And what I like about these original practices is not that we are reaching towards creating an authentic experience to make that which is foreign become familiar, that we are creating a bridge from the past to the future. So original pronunciation may help understand things of Shakespeare, but the future should not be that everyone speaks Shakespeare in original pronunciation. The future, hopefully, is that whilst we spent a lot of the last 100 years with the idea that Shakespeare should be spoken, received pronunciation, the British English, the Queen's English sound, that left a lot of people around the world who didn't have that accent feeling inadequate when it comes to Shakespeare, that they don't have the right accent for it, that they don't have the right sound for it. And the exploration in original pronunciation have really leveled the playing field and made the acknowledgement that British English, that BBC English accent, Queen's English accent, the Laurence Olivier Shakespeare accent, has only been around for the last 100 years or so. And that the original accents much more regional to people in different ways. It can sound more familiar, and I believe that it laid the pathway for understand the right, quote, quote, the right accent for Shakespeare is your accent and your voice, your language, because you want to speak it. Not because you should, because you've been told to, because there's an understanding that it will lead to great natural awareness or like the one, but just because words resonate with you, you want to voice them and give them to someone else.
Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan's signaling me. I have to open up the floor to questions. So if anybody has a question, you can just approach the microphone. Yes, Neil, can you please?
Hi everyone. I just had a quick question on the idea of playfulness because I think many of us were introduced to Shakespeare in a very formalistic, purist idea concept of Shakespeare. But then I do see that playfulness has opened up lots of new conceptualizations of Shakespeare. My question is, are there limits to playfulness, or sky's the limit, or at what point does it become a new entity as opposed to something still rooted in Shakespeare? So thank you, Paul.
Great question. Is there a limit? Maybe who sets the limits? Critics. No. Ben, do you have a quick answer to that one?
The only limit to playfulness, I suppose, is your imagination and to feel or being gifted the agency to know that there are no. We feel that these works of art should be very carefully handled and held in a vacuum and protected, but actually Shakespeare is Teflon. I've seen productions of Pericles set on the moon. It was terrible, but you can do anything you like with Shakespeare. The works are not going to go anywhere. Let's be rough with them. Let's treat them roughly and play with them like your best friend rolling around in the mud. Let's not keep them pristine and hope that the clothes don't get dirty.
Absolutely agree with that. Do you have anything to add, Beatrice?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yes.
We have I was going to say phone-in question. No, a question from online for Dr. Beatrice Lee. You said that Shakespeare can function and may be seen as lingua franca between cultures. Could you tell us what you think made his oeuvre qualify in the first place as such? What enduring qualities of his work do you think have enabled it to transcend time, cultural, social, socio-political, and linguistic boundaries?
So, of course, Shakespeare is a great writer. He has enormous inherent, merits, right? Literary excellence, and so on and so forth. He has great stories, great characters. But I would think that in every culture, every language, there is a great writer, right? Don't you have one here? I may not have read him, but you must have one, right? And there are Chinese writers, there are Japanese writers, and Spanish writers, right? So Shakespeare may be the greatest, but there are many great ones, right? And what made Shakespeare the lingua franca instead of, say, Cao Xueqing from Chinese literature, right? Well, we had the ambassador here. Right? She can best answer that question, right? I think a lot of it is the British Empire, right? And the American Empire after it, right? So that is why we're speaking English here and now instead of speaking Korean. Why are we not speaking Korean and studying, reading Korean playwrights and poets? Because they never ruled the world, right? So I think let's just be honest with it. I'm not saying Shakespeare, does not deserve it, does not deserve this position, but I think there are many other writers in different languages deserve if not a higher, at least an equal position, just because of their merits, their literary merits. But for historical reasons, we've got Shakespeare. And then the more we do it, the bigger he becomes, right? As I said, we do Asian Shakespeare Association. So we're always talking about Shakespeare because he enables us to talk to each other. And the more we talk, the bigger he becomes, and we talk even more. So yeah, that's where we are. And then I feel very grateful. I don't say, Shakespeare, you're a colonizer, go away. No, I think we should thank him for getting us here. And then what's more important for me as a 21st person Asian, 21st century Asian, I think what matters most is us. We're here. And whether we use, like I use US dollars to buy stuff, not because it looks prettier or it has, the print is better, the paper is of better quality. No, because it gets me the stuff. I speak English to you because if I spoke Chinese, you wouldn't understand me, right? So Shakespeare, wonderful. I love Shakespeare. That's why we're talking. That's how we can keep talking. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, in the context of Shakespeare today, I want to ask which of his works do you feel is the most evergreen in this day and age? And if it's because of the tragedy, would you say it's a case of him being ahead of his time, or is it because people failing to learn from the past and being doomed to repeat it?
I'm sorry, which of his plays are most, I didn't catch them.
Which of his works do you feel is the most evergreen in this day and age?
Evergreen?
Yeah.
Is that the millennial speak for something? Evergreen, like very relevant and yeah. Okay, thank you. So I don't speak. I don't speak Gen Z. Sorry. Which is I guess most relevant, the one that speaks most to the now. Yeah. I asked this in the form of which Shakespearean voice do you hear in your head every day? Is there a play that speaks to the now for you? Ben? Yes. I'm looking here. Ben? No, Ben.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, rather than a play, I have a quote that speaks to the now that it would be wonderful if we could get to as a society, as a species. It's from a play that I imagine many people haven't engaged with. It's from Two Noble Kinsmen. And there's a speech when Palamon and Arcite are in prison, and Arcite talks about their friendship. But for me, this is a quote that speaks to us all together on this world, I suppose. And it goes like this. Here, being us together, we are an endless mind to one another. We are one another's wife, for begetting new births, love. We are father, friends, acquaintance. We are in one another families. I am your heir, and you are mine. This place is our inheritance. No hard oppressor dares take this from us. Here, with a little patience, we shall live long, loving.
Thank you. Beatrice?
I'm thinking from King Lear. It's the time's plague when madmen lead the blind. So I thought of the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Chairman Mao and all the Red Guards. That's called madmen lead the blind. And I think about Trump and his voters and look around the world. That's what's happening. And then it's sad. But yeah, if we can see through that, maybe we have a better chance to fix it.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
No, if it's all right, I'll be reading from the script because I had to scaffold my thoughts while listening. But I think one of the last points that we talked about, or one of the latter points that we talked about, was the using Shakespeare as a tool to decolonize. And I guess I'm wondering about the flip side of it because the relevance of Shakespeare, as we've said, is almost founded on our history and our ability to mold the Shakespearean text according to the social politics of our time now. So it seems like for us, for Asians at least, for post colonies, it's easily made poignant. It's easily made relevant to our time now because, as you mentioned, Shakespeare can capture our lived realities because of how we've made him be able to do that, how we negotiated his text and his influence. So I guess what I'm curious about now is how it can be made relevant for a Western perspective, primarily because we're asking the question, why Shakespeare here? But we are able to mold it into our lived experience, I guess a question could also be why Shakespeare there? So,
So there's Shakespeare there or are Shakespeare there?
I guess I'm more curious about their Shakespeare there because it's easy to understand how Shakespeare can capture us, us as Filipinos, us as Asians, us as post colonies. But their Shakespeare there, I wonder how it still retains its relevance for their audience and in relation to their context.
Okay, Ben, I guess that's your question.
Forgive me, the sound was a little tricky. Is it how? Could you repeat it for me, Judy?
She was asking about the continuing relevance of Shakespeare there, meaning in the West, because she thinks she has a clear idea of how it could be made relevant in the Philippines and in Asia, because from the examples that Beatrice had shown. But she was wondering about how Shakespeare remains relevant, I guess, in England, in the UK, in the land of Shakespeare.
Gosh, that's a great question. I'm not sure if it is remaining relevant. I think the younger generations are really struggling to find a place for Shakespeare after, as I explained earlier, you know, a not particularly useful introduction in mainstream education. And we are certainly experiencing great ripples post-pandemic in that a lot of theatres and arts institutions in general are really struggling to get people out of their homes and back into theatres and museums and art galleries. That what has become easy and inexpensive is to stay at home and to stay on the couch and to stay with the television that kept everyone company during the year of isolation. And how do we ask, how do we get people to a place where they feel that leaving that safe, warm, cozy nest and stepping back out into the world and coming to a building that might be intimidating, either architecturally or culturally, or even intellectually, that how does any art institution program its content in a way that is exciting and enticing, enough for people to spend money to engage with it? And how do we to focus in on Shakespeare for now, how do we, within all of the different range of arts and entertainments that there are in these institutions, how do we make Shakespeare exciting when most people in this country, in the UK, and to a degree in Europe, have this this idea, as the ambassador said, Shakespeare apparently is impenetrable. Shakespeare is difficult. Shakespeare is you have to be clever to understand it, and even if you do go and see a production, as the ambassador explained, what chances will it be that it will be one that will grip you? What if it's one that bores you? And I think we put a lot of pressure on ourselves and a lot of pressure on Shakespeare, whereas actually we need to be putting a lot of funding and pressure on the artists that are bringing these works of art to us. Sometimes Shakespeare performance is bad because it's not being well put together, it's not being well acted, it's not being well produced. We as practitioners need to work a lot harder to keep these works available. Yeah, I think Shakespeare is losing some relevance over here, and at the same time, it will never be lost because there's so much nostalgic and romantic wonder in the use of language. As you said, the thousand odd words that Shakespeare invented that are still being used today, and the cultural heritage too. Already, because we're bringing our 20th, 21st century attitude to Shakespeare, there are plays like Othello and Taming the Shrew, the Merchant of Venice, that people are deciding shouldn't perform because they offend in some way when viewed through the prism of a 20th, 21st century mindset. And I think it's really important when we're talking about how to keep Shakespeare relevant, that we remember when Shakespeare held the mirror up to life to show us the beautiful things about us as a species, to explore the human condition, that he also held the mirror up to reflect into the shadow of ourselves, that he explores really dark parts of humanity too. Now, there are really great lessons in his work about how to be better, more honest, more loving, more caring, and also how to be aware that we have the capacity for terrible acts and thoughts too. So I think we need to work harder and dare harder and challenge ourselves more to keep Shakespeare relevant over here, at least.
Okay, so you guys over there heard that. The artists over here, we can't afford to have bad Shakespeare, okay? The pressure is on you. Any other questions? Yes.
Hello po. This question goes to Miss Beatrice. For me, one of the hallmarks of Shakespeare works are his works encompasses a lot of human experiences, just like Iliad and Odyssey by Homer or the Bible. So my question is, the young generation or the young people today are not on the same page. They can connect their world to Shakespeare. So what are these factors? What are the reasons why they can connect their world to Shakespeare to experience this human experience in Shakespeare way?
Well, I think Shakespeare has a relatively long career that he wrote. He started writing as a young man and he wrote until into his old age. So I think fortunately he wrote many plays. So I think for different age groups, the plays each has their own appeal. So like, I don't think my students can really appreciate King Lear, for example. That's for old people, or even The Tempest. But I feel like when I do it in my class, I think or Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet work really well with my students because it's their age. So I told my students, when we were doing Hamlet, I said, just imagine that you're in Taipei going to college and your home is in Kaohsiung, right, in the south. And then, it's, summer vacation. So you go home and realize that, what has happened, right? So it's something like that. I think not every Shakespearean play is for everybody, but, as teachers, as scholars, you can do anything. But as teachers, I think maybe with careful selection, you can get something that appeals to your students, and then you can use comparisons. And I think, yeah, it will work if you choose the right play. I tried King Lear, but I feel like by the time we get to the young generation, the students are already tired. They're like, oh, why do I care what an 80-year-old person thinks? So yeah, I would say to young students, try, and then maybe when they turn 40, 60, 80, they will get to appreciate the older plays or the more political, historical plays. Yeah.
One last question. Yes.
I would like to ask, since it seems that the discussion we're having tonight is more about how how readers and writers must utilize some sort of intertextuality to enjoy Shakespeare, because most of our discussions surround around reimagining what Shakespeare could be before and what Shakespeare could be today. But then that also brings the question, which is actually the question I want to ask. Can we really say that Shakespeare is still relevant if we must reimagine it to enjoy it?
Who would like to start with?
Okay, I think, my specialty in doing my PhD is actually 16th century non-dramatic. So I studied Spenser and Sidney, and then I also did minor in medieval English literature. So I know Chaucer, and then these are things that I love. If you ask me why, is it because I think it's fun. So I think for scholars, you can be interested in anything, and that is fine, right? And then there are specialists in every field. It can be as narrow and as deep as you want. But and then if you're teaching a PhD program, that's fine too. But as teachers, I actually, Shakespeare, because in Taiwan, high school students don't read Shakespeare. College students don't read Shakespeare. English majors don't have to read Shakespeare, okay? Because we don't have as much English as you have here. So, I cannot make my students like Sidney or Spenser or Chaucer or Milton. And Shakespeare, it's not a must for them. It's really not. So I think reimagining Shakespeare is like a bridge to seduce the students into crossing the bridge and then going deeper. Maybe some of those that have been seduced by the Chinese opera or Bollywood Shakespeare would eventually cross the bridge and get a PhD in Shakespeare or in original pronunciation, right? But before you get them over, you have to get them over. That's like the first step. So before they get enough English to really enjoy Shakespeare in its original, it takes efforts. And then as teachers, we just need to try every way It can be a movie. It doesn't have to be like reimagined in Chinese opera or Indian dance, but maybe a movie adaptation, a modernized version. I think anything help. I would not, close any door. If anything that can get the students over and to read Chaucer, to read Milton, I would do it.
Ben, do you have something to add to that?
Honestly, I think Beatrice put it perfectly.
Okay. Well, I do. Well, just to say that, see, reimagination is essential to theater. It is what theater is about, right? And every night in every show, you go out and reimagine a play. I mean, if you've ever been part of a production, you know that. You never step into the same play twice. And so I really think that reimagination is theater. And the way we're doing with Shakespeare Now is no different from what theater really is. What we have to sort of, I think what we have to sort of turn away from is this idea that there's this original Shakespeare, this authentic Shakespeare that we're trying to recreate. It's not, that's long gone. Okay. And every act of staging is an act of reimagining. So why not do it to escape censorship, right? Why not do it to make a political point? Why not do it for all kinds of reasons? You know? And that's, I guess, how he remains relevant. Now, I know I said that was the last question, but this young woman over here wants to be, in true Filipino fashion, the last question.
Hi, sorry for standing up when Miss Judy said she'll take the last question, but I'm pretty sure half of my question was already answered by or was asked by Indy, the girl who came before me. But I was talking with my friends about it, and the mention of reimagining Shakespeare is a very Shakespeare there kind of, I guess, kind of context, since I mean, or at least with the how I will say it, because Shakespeare here can be very localized contextually, because we live in a very social political time in Asia, and Shakespeare as a very social political literature works very well in our like within the context. But also we mentioned how Shakespeare there tends to be more abstract, I guess, because I feel like pop culture has made complete use of Shakespeare ideas. Like, I don't know if you guys know, but a few months ago, like at the start of the year, a movie starring Sydney Sweeney went very popular and trendy all over the like social media. And then people were so surprised hearing that it's actually influenced by Shakespeare's A Much Ado About Nothing. And it's a very different idea from the usual Western media consumed na parang, or like how people assume that Shakespearean movies contextualized within the 21st century. It's usually very Romeo and Juliet cliche type, and that's what gets people interested, or gets the masses, the people that are like in the non-academe interested in Shakespeare. So I guess my question is, I wanted to ask if you guys think, or if you guys agree that the use of pop culture to gather interest in Shakespeare makes it more accessible to the public, since very few people, I guess, would be interested in Shakespeare because he's hard, and the adaptations of him tend to be, if not as difficult, a little harder to access if you're not informed of him. So
Okay. So Ben, are you on TikTok?
No,
Well, the question was about the use of popular culture in Shakespeare. Would you like to speak to that for a bit?
it's something that can seem very useful, very immediate, a short circuit towards accessibility and relevance. And well, at least for the last 20 years or so, the classic example that rebuts that is if you bring mobile phones to a play like Romeo and Juliet, then, you know, Romeo not knowing what happens to Juliet at the end immediately becomes such a big logical problem for an audience. It pulls them out of the play. I think that any culture explorations or additions, layerings, if you will, to a Shakespeare play, like we spoke about at the beginning, it can give it a sense of accessibility and relevance. If the work isn't done by the artists to access the emotional core of what Shakespeare is talking about, what Shakespeare is writing into these characters, then, well, let's put it a different way. If the actors are accessing that emotional core, you could put any layer on top of it, and to a degree, it will work, makes sense. If it doesn't have that gravitas, that weight inside each character, then in some respects, it doesn't matter what costume or set you put on top of it, it will probably not make much sense to you.
Beatrice?
Yeah, I already said, you know, pop culture, any culture, whatever, if you can get people to, to read and to learn about literature, yeah, not just Shakespeare. I would do pop culture with Sydney and Spencer and Milton and Chaucer if we could, and Chinese literature. I think, yeah, anything.
Okay. Well, there you have it. I guess all of that remains. Oh, I guess Beatrice has a request. She has the last slide.
Yeah,
If you
I
can
have the
show
last
it.
slide. I want to conclude this session
as
with a
a
quote.
conclusion to
Yeah.
this discussion.
It's to, really answer this question, why Shakespeare now, why Shakespeare here? Let's skip ahead. These are the Malaysian ones. This is Julius and this one. Okay, so this is Ricky. Theater is not just an art, it is a weapon of change. And the better the students, that's you, become, the more effective they will be in liberating people, including themselves, from oppressive systems, intellectual rigidity, and moral backwardness. So I think that's what I want to say about Shakespeare. Shakespeare is a weapon of change. Thank you.
So I guess we started with the Ateneo and its history, and we ended with Ateneo, and the greatest Shakespearean Ateneo has ever produced, has ever been in our country. Love you, Ricardo Abad.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, Judy. One last